Understanding the technology that powers the money is essential. Knowing the business drivers that inspire how the money is made is crucial. Bridging the gap between the mind of the technologist and the mind of the business is monumental. That is what TBF is all about. Let's start this never-ending conversation. It's time.
Oh, good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of the Tech Behind FinTech. I'm your host, Nnamdi Oswagu. I am hosting today's show. So what are we talking about today? Today's show is the $10.5 trillion backdoor, why poor API security is a goldmine for hackers. We were going to have a guest on today, Stephen. Unfortunately, he is very sick this morning and he could not attend. But we will still move forward with the show and the show topic, and we'll go through it and discuss it. We wish Steve Mac the best of health and hope he gets better and a speedy recovery. On that note, let's go over some housekeeping. We are streaming live from Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. We also have a separate stream going from Instagram. Like always, comments are really helpful. Obviously, we were prepared to host a show for guests. We're not doing that today. We're still going to talk about the topic. So if you have any insights on API security, definitely join the conversation. Let's make this a really informative show for everyone. I'm passionate about DevSecOps and application security, so I have some background in it, and we'll go over it from my perspective, and hopefully everybody can learn something and we can all add into the conversation. So let me get my stuff together and we will proceed with the show. Always exciting stuff. So it's funny, right? Like usually this part of the show, we introduce the guests, but because there's not a guest today, I guess we can just kick it off, right? So let's do just that. So, $10.5 trillion, that's a huge number. And, we didn't come up with the title for this particular episode to put such a huge number to scare people. This number actually comes from different sources. So it's estimated that on a global annual cost, a couple of years ago, he said by 2025, it's always interesting to when people say by this time, and now you're in this time, right? So he said by 2025, this number will represent the financial losses from hacking, data breaches, ransomware, fraud, and stolen information, all growing from weak cybersecurity, including poor API security threats. So where does this $10.5 trillion number come from? So we have the Security Ventures report. They estimated that cybercrime will cost $10.5 trillion annually by 2025, up from $3 trillion in 2015. So it's 10 years ago, right? It's interesting to talk about numbers in the trillions and when we're just so used to talking about millions, right, and billions, but now we're in the trillions. So pretty huge in terms of the financial impact from such a thing. So at 10 years ago, we were at 3 trillion, and they estimated that will be at 10.5 trillion by the end of this year in 2025. Also, IBM cost of data breach report that came out in 2023 reports that the average cost of a data breach is now 4.5 million per incident, right? So that's per incident. Gartner and the OWASP API reports, they indicated that 75% of security flaws are API related, making APIs a major attack surface for financial institutions. And I know we talk about we're going to be talking about APIs and so forth, but before we actually jump into that topic, oh, shout out to friends joining from Instagram. I have to do a little wave there. Before we get into API security, because you're going to hear about that a lot throughout this show, I think it's important that we jump into what is an API, right? It stands for Application Programming Interface, right? And what it does is helps different apps talk to each other. So a simple analogy is like a waiter, right? So you're at a restaurant and the waiter comes to take your order, and you tell the waiter what you want. The waiter goes back to the kitchen and brings you back food. So think about that like an analogy for an API between you're an app, and the cook or chef is another app, and that waiter is leveraging communication. They have the menu, and they have different ways they can communicate back and forth for you to get what you want. So it's that type of interaction in terms of dealing with different kind of apps. And it's similar to a bad waiter that can mess up an order. APIs can have security flaws that let hackers steal, change, or mess with sensitive data. So I hope that gives you a overview or high level overview of what an API is, an application programming and interface. In simple terms, it's basically how different applications communicate with each other. And you wonder, right, in everything that you use and all the applications that you use, especially now we're talking about FinTech, so we can look at payments apps that you use, Venmo, different things. They all have third parties that they have to deal with. It's part of the ecosystem. In order for them to communicate, they have to leverage APIs. And even within the app itself, they use internal APIs to communicate within different functionality and systems within the app. So, that's what an API is. It's extremely important for all applications, especially in the FinTech, outside of FinTech as well. So, we wanted let's have a baseline there before we start jumping into the to further topics. So, on that note, right? So, why is an API a major security concern? Because they expose sensitive financial data to the internet, making them an easy target for cybercriminals. They, API related breaches can lead to massive fraud, identity theft, unauthorized access. And as more FinTechs rely on APIs, weak security turns them into a gold mine for hackers. Hence, today's topic, which we say the title is, the $10.5 trillion backdoor and why poor API security is a gold mine for hackers. So, that's the overview of why that is. And, let's go over some breaches that happened over the last 6 years. 2019, Venmo, their API data was exposed. They had a public API that allowed the scraping of over 200 million transactions, exposing users' full names, transaction values, and also memos. So, this incident highlighted, privacy concerns and so forth. 2021, Experian, API vulnerability permitted unauthorized individuals to access credit scores of tens of millions of Americans by using their names and addresses. So think about it. We all get our credit reports, right? We use Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. And you can imagine all of that data that's on your credit report. Sensitive data, right? So, that particular vulnerability allowed the unauthorized individuals to scrape tens of millions of people. So 2022 company Revolut data breach, right? Information regarding a 2022 related data breach infected Revolut. But they get that much details on that one, but that was it was another that happened for Revolut. And there was in 2023 there was a Coinbase SMS two-factor authentication bypass. Not a lot of details we researched on that, but those are the big ones. But the big ones on the list: Experian and Venmo. Those were huge. So what we can do. Let me see if I can make this available on a screen. I was going to go through, right? We have a discussion on, now that we know this is an issue, how do we actually, what can we do to prevent it? So this is a really good question. There's a concept. We're going to go over some few things, right? And I want to talk about nonprofit called OWASP. They're a really, really the Open Web Application Security Project. They're a global nonprofit organization focused on improving software security. So it's like a security rule book for developers, helping them build safer apps and protect users. They put out a lot of guidance on how we should build software and the different mobile applications and the different things that we should do. And they come out with this top 10 list, right? So they have a top 10 list for mobile applications. It's a top 10 security list. So these are the major security vulnerabilities that you should look out for and how to avoid them. So they have one for mobile application security, different software. And they also have one for API. So what we're going to do is, part of this show, we're going to go through the OWASP top 10 and break each one down, and different vulnerabilities out there, and break each one down. Before getting into that, let's dive into some stuff, right? So I was going to say, I have believe in this concept called, we've been talking about it for years in the industry. It's really called like shift left. And what that essentially means is moving security over to the beginning. So let's start all over. So I had a lot of people, if you're not in technology, might not understand what the hell I'm talking about. But let's look at the software development lifecycle from left to right. Meaning, you think of this cool idea that's going to make you $1 billion, right? So you're thinking about the idea, and as you're thinking about it, you're breaking it down to different components that need to be built. So that's all the way on the left-hand side. Now you start the process of gathering your requirements, architecting it, so forth, and building it. Now you start shifting over more to the right. As you develop it, test it, bring it out to UAT, and then further production, you're all the way to the right? The end. You have a product, right? Version 0.1 or something like that. So that whole concept, in a simplified way, describes the software development lifecycle, right? Historically, the problem was we think about security and we're further into the right-hand side of that. That gets very expensive, right? Because you already built it. Now you have to, bolt on security. So the goal from an industry perspective, what we started to do was saying, how can we embed security throughout that entire process, starting all the way from the left, right, and moving it through the different checkpoints throughout the software development lifecycle all the way to the right. So at the baseline there, talking about the different things you're building, and if you have some APIs as part of the development process, you want to start testing them early. You want to start things, even before you develop, like threat modeling, adding these types of security requirements and different things that you're going to do into your backlog. That's what we call it. Most people develop on an agile methodology, and it's something called a backlog. Simply put, when you start outlining all of your different requirements that you have to put in to this series of cycles that will get you to your end product. Sometimes, core functionalities, not sometimes, all the time, functionalities there, but sometimes they don't include the security parts in that process. So, heavily believe in this concept called DevSecOps, in which you're adding in your different security checkpoints. You're trying to automate that process as much as possible to automate testing. One of those tests that you can leverage is doing static code analysis. Static code analysis is like taking, like, if you have a Word document, right, and you're trying to just quickly scan grammatical errors. You could do the same thing for software. Instead of grammatical errors, you're actually looking for security flaws. Once you have an active endpoint available, and like even in test, even in not fully in prod yet, you can run some dynamic application security test on it. So now it's up, right? Whether it's in a development environment, QA environment, so forth, and now you're running different security scans and so forth. Within that process, you can actually start looking for API related issues. I in my career and as I consult, I use an open source tool that actually started from OWASP and now outside of OWASP, called Zap. And it's a whole security suite that you can run against your applications and so forth. So you can look for these security issues earlier, and you can start solving for it way before you get to production. So that's one thing I wanted to talk about before we jump into the OWASP top 10. And listen, going over some terms that may be new to some people and so forth. So at any time, jump in with the comments. If you have anything to add and you are you have some expertise in this area, add that too. So whether it's questions, whether it's comments, definitely welcome the feedback and so forth. Okay. So once again, I know we said this in the beginning. For those tuning in, today's show, we were going to have a guest. Unfortunately, he got very sick this morning and could not attend. So I'm doing a solo show, but we're going over the same topic that was scheduled. These are things that happen during a live show. You really can't, certain things you can't control, and you just have to move forward with it. So on that note, for those tuning in, just wanted to mention that. Okay, so where are we at, right? Talking about, I want to go over some things, right? I want to go over, before I jump into the OWASP top 10, let's understand some risks, right? Like, why are APIs considered one of the biggest security risks in fintech, right? They are the front door to your financial data, right? And we talked about the breaches that happened previously, right? So, from APIs that connect banking apps to third-party services and payment networks, right? A compromised API can give direct access to users' accounts, payment systems, personal data, and many APIs are public-facing, meaning anyone on the internet can try to attack them. So some common API failures, right? Weak authentication. So, essentially, some APIs don't require strong user verification. Over permissive access. So some APIs often expose more data than they should. And as we talked about previously with the concept of shift left, right? As you start designing your systems and saying, okay, what information are we going to expose and so forth, and you start threat modeling, you can actually start to understand, are we giving more information that's needed? And you can kind of solve for some of these things without as much coding or technical prowess, right? It's just basically saying, okay, what's needed that we should give access to, and are we giving too much? Plain text data storage, right? Some APIs store financial information without encryption. So as you know, with plain text, meaning that it's human readable, right? It's not encrypted, so anyone access can see it. Some public APIs are left unprotected. Attackers can scrape data. So as we talked about with the Venmo breach in 2019, 200 million users were scraped, right? And also with Experian, right? They allow attackers to pull credit scores using just the person's name and address, no password required. So, as we go through these things, it's really interesting to look at real world examples where some of these techniques were actually exploited. Uh, so, what we can do now is let's talk about some top API exploitation techniques. I want to go over, and then I want to go over the top 10. So, credential stuffing and brute force attacks, right? Hackers test stolen password and API login. So, it's so funny because uh, a friend of mine, good friend of mine, we always talk about, but we don't, we're both in, she does security recruiting, Renee Small, cybersecurity super recruiter. She's sometimes on the show, but offline we have this joke because we're both in cybersecurity and we use the term brute force. And every time we talk about brute force, it essentially we're essentially meaning like just go hard on something. Mainly talk about it from business related standpoint, but from a cybersecurity standpoint, right? What is a brute force attack? It's essentially going hard on something. It's just like you're just throwing everything at the wall, trying to. It's a long guessing game, but it can definitely bog down resources from the person that the threat actor is trying to attack. So weak authentication that equals easy account takeover. So the next top exploitation technique, token hijacking and session reuse, right? So if an API fails to validate an expired or stolen tokens, attackers can hijack the user sessions. Number 3, we have man-in-the-middle attacks. So unencrypted APIs allow attackers to intercept financial transactions. 4, you have broken object authorization. So attackers can modify API requests to access someone else's financial data. And that's the number one API security risk, OWASP top 10 security risk, right? So let's go over it. It's called broken object level authorization, right? An analogy is, let's think about that. It's a good analogy for Ebola. It's essentially, so imagine a school where every student has a locker, right? But instead of needing your key, you can open anyone's locker just by guessing the locker number. So essentially, in this, from the security API standpoint, hackers find ways to access the data they shouldn't. It's like seeing someone else's bank account. How to fix it? APIs need strict rules about who can open which lockers or access the data. So that's one of the OWASP top 10, right? And let's go over the OWASP top 2. Let's go over the OWASP top 10. I want to kind of switch gears. Like I said, right? So OWASP is this nonprofit organization that really helps the industry with software security and so forth. And they come out with this top 10 list. And I wanted to go over, like we're going over the top API exploits, and it kind of relates to this OWASP top 10, in which they talk about the top 10 vulnerabilities and for it in different ways, but we're talking about API specifically here, and how, and what we can talk about is how to prevent that, and how I want to structure it, because some of these things people might not be familiar with. I want to structure it by giving analogies for each of the top 10 and just going on and talking about how we could possibly fix it. What's up, man? One of my old college roommate, he's just tuned in. I just saw him tuned in on Instagram. Appreciate it. All right, so OWASP. So we talked about number 1, Ebola. Let's go over broken authentication. That's an OWASP. That's number 2. What's an analogy for that, right? So you borrow a hall pass from a friend to leave class, but you now can roam the entire school all day, right? And the teachers don't check if that's your actual hall pass. So what happens from a security standpoint? Hackers still log in tokens like a hall pass and pretend to be someone else to access sensitive accounts. So how do we fix this? We have to make sure that every token is checked and expires after a short time, because these tokens are used for access. So you have them. If it takes a long time to expire, that gives the threat actor more time to leverage it. Let's go over the number 3, broken object property level authorization, right? So an analogy, right? I like these little school analogies are pretty cool to help describe it and break it down. But think about your school yearbook is supposed to show your name and photo, but by flipping through an extra pages, you suddenly see everybody's grades and home address, right? So APIs sometimes give out too much data that hackers can use. Remember, we talked about that before, over permissive. So, how to fix it, right? Simple. Only show what's necessary, no secret pages, but how to catch it, right? And if you think about this concept that you're giving too much information in the beginning of your software development lifecycle, you can start as you architect these solutions, you can kind of give a diagram of what you're going to expose, and in that, and then you should kind of follow that rule book so you're not being over permissive. So that's how to broken object property authorization. We're gonna go over 5. I think we should stop at 5, not the whole top 10. So that'll be cool. So we're almost coming towards the half an hour, and I could obviously just keep going. So number 4, unrestricted resource consumption, right? So it's like an all-you-can-eat buffet disaster, right? You know how a buffet lets people eat as much as they want, but what if one person orders 1,000 plates of food? The restaurant runs out and no one else can eat, right? So hackers or threat actors can flood APIs with too many requests, causing the system to crash or slow down. So something called like a denial of service request. So that's similar to that. So how do you fix an unrestricted resource consumption? You put a limit, right? How much one person can request at a time. So sometimes if you don't have these rate limits, something like that could happen. You can it can overflow your resources, and it's just the resource consumption will be just too much to handle for your system, and then everyone else who needs legitimate API requests won't be able to get them. All right, let's go over number 5, OWASP from the OWASP top 10, right? Broken function level authorization, so BFLA, right? Analogy, right? Student finds a way to sneak into the principal's office to change their grades in the system. So, so think about that, right? Some student now goes to the principal's office and finds a way to change their grade. So how does that's like an analogy. So we're looking at broken function level authorization from a security standpoint. Some APIs don't check if a person should have admin level permissions, so the hackers can delete, change, or steal data. So, it's basically allowing someone to go into the principal's office and do whatever they want. So how do you fix it, right? You have to double check who you should be allowed to make changes. So it's definitely something dealing now with administration and just understanding from a permission standpoint, who should have what level of permissions. All right. So there's, and listen, you can look this up, Google it. If you go to OWASP top 10, you'll find a lot of information on that. And that's just different, the major vulnerabilities that you should look out for when architecting your systems for API. And, following these types of things that like the OWASP top 10 and so forth. And as you start developing your system, you can solve the majority of your potential security related problems. The problem is we don't really, in general, it's not done. Hence this $10.5 trillion number. Hence, 75% of breaches coming from APIs and so forth. So there's simple like security hygiene things you can do. Look up the OWASP 10. You don't necessarily even have to be on security. If you're a developer, if you are a stakeholder, it's good to understand this stuff. It's good to then use it to ask questions to your tech team and be like, listen, how are we addressing the list in the OWASP top 10 regarding API information? Like I said, they have top 10 lists for API, mobile data, software, and so forth. Just that from an API perspective, it's just more public facing, so it can be breached or compromised a little bit easier than the other stuff. So you want to kind of address these types of low hanging fruit. And like I said, the OWASP Top 10 is a good place to start, especially if you're kind of new to API security and so forth. And once again, because we talked about in the beginning of the show, API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's the way two different systems interact with each other. And in some cases, you have, not in some, most cases, you also have APIs that are used internally by the same systems, but it's just the way different software code interacts with, or applications interact with each other. All right, so really, interesting discussion. And, this is something in general we can dive deeper. I definitely know we talked about API before, but not from this angle. But let's kind of get into some other stuff, and we see some other. It's going through some of the show notes. I'm going to kind of I like leaving you guys with the OWASP Top 10. I think that's definitely important. I want to also talk about some tools that can help, right? Oh, you know what? No, listen, before we go into that, and mind you, for those that just came on, we had a guest scheduled today, but unfortunately they got sick and they could not make it. So I'm doing a solo show and just going through some API security and so forth. And I want to kind of lead with some things here that we can leave with, that we can so part of the what we just talked about from the OWASP Top 10. So let's talk about some best practices in securing APIs. Use strong authentication, right? We talked about that as part of that's a cool thing, right? So when you start looking at the OWASP Top 10 and start looking at like major vulnerabilities that are exploited by threat actors, you can now take that information and say, okay, how do we protect against that? And it'll lead you into best practices. Okay, got some other people joining, man. What's up? Talking about API security today. I'm going through. It's a solo show. Our guest unfortunately got sick, and we're running a solo show. I just have to put that out there for new people joining this live discussion. So from a best practices standpoint, use strong authentication, encrypt data properly, rate limit, what we talked about before, in which you just want to put limits on how much resources can be used by individual requesters, leverage API gateways, right? And it's interesting because this term zero trust is used a lot. It's a whole other discussion, but I don't want to really dive too deep into it in this one because that's a whole show topic. But never trust internal APIs without verification. Also, regular API penetration tests, right? Find and patch vulnerabilities before hackers do. So really important, right? Why not actually test the security of your system by doing penetration tests? Whether you get an external company and whether you do an internal penetration test, right? You want to kind of put yourself in a situation that you're leveraging the same tools that a threat actor would against your system, especially when it's a public-facing endpoint. Very important. So that's definitely some of the best practices that can be leveraged. Let's talk about some tools, right? Zap, I mentioned that, that's something I personally use a lot, not only for APIs, but in general for dynamic application security testing. And, some use it for penetration testing and so forth. You find the vulnerability, and from the vulnerability, you see how it could be exploited. Burp Suite, it's another good one, right? Relatively cheap too. Some API security, Akamai, Cloudflare, Okta, and Auth. That's for identity management, API security. So those are some tools that can be used, right? And once again, use these tools to find vulnerabilities, and then you start cleaning those things up and securing it. Okay, so I want to go over the tools. What else? What's the last thing? Pretty much that's pretty much it for today's topic. I know our guest, he specializes in this, so he would have had like a deeper dive, but I think you got a good overview today, right? Understanding what an API is, looking at past breaches, going over best practices. We also talked about the OWASP top 10 and how to leverage it, which is good. And also talked about an explanation of DevSecOps and looking at the entire software development lifecycle. So, I think that is it's going to be a wrap, man. Listen, you guys come every week to look at the live show. I know we advertised that we're going to be talking about this $10.5 trillion backdoor and why poor API security is a goldmine for hackers. And I wanted to make sure that I had information for the audience, although we definitely although we had to do a solo show because of our guest was sick. So, in general, let's summarize, right? We went over this $10.5 trillion threat. It was $3.5 trillion, not threat, but in terms of potential financial losses due to cybersecurity breaches. They estimated in 2025, it'll be 10.5 trillion. That is up from 3 trillion in 2015, right? So we went over that. We talked about the sources where these numbers came from. We talked about why API security is a major concern, especially in the financial markets. Talked about what is an API, right? For those who don't know, application programming interface. We went over breaches from the last 6 years related to APIs. We talked about best practices. We introduced the OWASP top 10. We also talked about DevSecOps in terms of introducing security all the way in the beginning of the software development lifecycle throughout production, which will help you build a more secure system. We went over some tools. We went over best practices. You know what? I think that will conclude our show today. I thank you all for joining in, right? If you want the details on that, the show links will be found at Tech Behind FinTech. It'll be on obviously forever now that it's out, and you can look at the show if you want to learn more and just go over some of those topics that we discussed. I thank you all for tuning in today. Definitely appreciate it. We wish our guest who couldn't make it, we wish him the best of health and a speedy recovery. And we will be back for another live show next week with another outstanding guest, and we will keep rocking on. Thank you very much for joining this live podcast in the Tech Behind FinTech. You can find us on the techbehindfintech.com. If you have not done so already, please go to the Tech Behind FinTech and subscribe. We have a weekly newsletter that talks about the latest FinTech news, breaches, and also our show notes and upcoming guests. You definitely want to be a part of that newsletter. Go to Tech Behind FinTech /subscribe. Put your name in and your email, and you will get a free newsletter every week and be up to date. You'll have your hand on the pulse of what's going on in FinTech with our newsletter and so forth. And we look forward to more live shows and bringing you guys the information that can help you out to understand more about the FinTech industry, and also give some more insights to our professionals who subscribe to our show and watch us every week. Thank you very much for your time. Have a wonderful weekend. Cheers.
Understanding the technology that powers the money is essential. Knowing the business drivers that inspire how the money is made is crucial. Bridging the gap between the mind of the technologist and the mind of the business is monumental. That is what TBF is all about. Let's start this never-ending conversation. It's time.